There's one more component that I think is absolutely necessary to add for a realistic skin material, and that is blemishes. So let's maximize our reference and observe what I mean. I'm going to switch to my pen so I can start highlighting some blemish spots. Now, the most obvious ones are things like freckles and moles. All right, these little brown spots that are the most obvious difference in color and value to the rest of the skin. These stick out pretty obviously, but some more than others. Like this one is extremely noticeable, but this one is a little less noticeable. So these are commonly on everyone's faces to some degree or another. Here on this cheek, we can see a ton sprinkled about. But a less obvious type of blemish comes down to a type of patchiness on the skin. So the closer we look at this guy's nose, we'll start to see a fairly harsh outline of this patch that's a little more red than the rest of the skin. All right, if I turn that annotation on and off, it might not be that noticeable with the lines off, but hopefully with them drawn, you can start to see the discoloration, especially right here on the tip of the nose. Look how harsh that is. Well, I say harsh. Again, it's not overly noticeable by itself. It's one of these subtle layers, but once you're focused on that blemish, it's a pretty harsh line. And these kind of things show up all over the face. Here's another one right here in the cheek. All right, just a red spot. And let's move on to another one, because again, a blemish component I see in everyone's face that is realistically presented. Obviously in model shots, they try to reduce these. Makeup tries to reduce this as well. But this person doesn't have as many moles and freckles. There's maybe a few tiny ones here and there, but the patchiness pattern is definitely there. And, you know, I'm going to try and outline this fairly large reddish patch where it's a lighter skin on this side, kind of reddish here. Within the patches, there's also just kind of like a noisy pattern. It's hard to, you know, represent this with lines, but a noise texture is going to make this very believable. And yeah, I recommend that you look over these photos and take note of what these blemishes look like. This person, I think, has excellent complexion, so the blemishes are going to be a little more subtle. But once you start looking for blemishes, in my experience, you can't unsee them. So here again, I see these little spots and kind of noisy patterns all over the place. And even a few little like freckle spots here and there. And the nose, you know, like almost a marbleizing kind of pattern. Again, very hard to visualize with these annotation marks, but hopefully you've got an idea of what I'm going to be implementing in our material. And it's actually not that difficult, and I think it has a huge payoff at the end. So I love adding the blemish component. And there's so many ways you could go about this. When it comes to noise, there's just a ton of options, but I'm going to give you something of a formula that will at least get you started with how to manipulate this particular component. And so we're going to put it over here because I'm going to connect it into the color with a color mix RGB. And so I'm going to kind of reserve this spot off to the left for these nodes. And we're going to begin with a Musgrave texture and Control T to add some texture coordinates. I'm going to be using object texture coordinates, and we really don't need the mapping node. So we'll Control X to get rid of that and grab our object coordinates, plug it straight into the vector. Well, we might need the mapping towards the end, but for now we don't need it. And let's switch to rendered view in our viewport, Shift Control click on the Musgrave to see what it's all about. And it's kind of this Dalmatian pattern with strong white spots and strong black spots, so high contrast. And I'm going to bump the scale up a bit. Let's try 20. So we have a slightly higher frequency of white spots and dark spots. So this is going to become the mask where I'm going to fill the dark areas with a noise texture and fill the white areas with a slightly different noise texture. And this will result in a type of patchiness that we saw in the reference. And then we'll take the detail up to 10. That works just like the noise texture to increase the frequency of the pattern. Then dimension, if we start to take that lower, that also will break up the pattern. Let's go to like 0.3. There we go. So we're starting to get a pattern that's similar to this kind of patchy thing that we outlined, right? And then the last setting, lacunarity, I think is how you'd pronounce that. Never seen this word anywhere else in my life. Let's start playing with that setting. And this tends to warp it around. The higher we go, it looks like the pattern is broken up a little bit, but it's definitely just kind of swirling the pattern around. Let's leave it at a value of 2 for a good even number. And this type of patchy pattern is in a great direction as a factor, which we will then mix, color, mix RGB, 2 different noise textures together. So let's add texture noise and shift right click to grab a reroute node to make this obvious that we are using the same texture coordinates. And let's shift control click on the noise by itself. And first thing I often do when I want a high frequency detail, which is a big power of these procedural textures, is bump up the detail level to 10. And also let's add a converter color ramp because we'll want the contrast to be easily manipulated. And so I'm going to kind of increase that myself. There we go. We have a little bit more difference between light and dark. Not as much as the Musgrave texture though. And then the roughness, the higher we go towards 1, the more distinguished the breakup is. All right, so that pattern is starting to look like this type of noise pattern that you see sprinkled in here. And then maybe some distortion. I usually like to add a little bit of distortion starting at like 0.2. It just slightly swirls the pattern around. If you go too high, the swirl is a little too distinct and we don't want, this like clouds of Jupiter type thing going on. So I like 0.2. And then we will duplicate these nodes. And then we just need to move around the settings a little bit. So let's increase the scale. Let's say to 10. We'll leave the detail high, but then the roughness, maybe take it down a little bit, like 0.6. And let's combine those into this mix node to see what we have. Shift control click on the mix. And we should see a blend of these two noises based on the patchiness. And I feel like maybe the noise textures aren't as different from each other. I can see a pretty distinguished patch right here between them, which does look good, but maybe I just need to reduce some of the contrast in one of the noises. And again, the beauty of this is we can zoom way in and the noise level still holds up much better than if we were to paint this texture, or we would just need like an 8K texture to paint this by hand. And so I think this is a really good place to start. Let's connect it into our skin color component right here, and we'll set it as an overlay into color 2. Shift control click on this. All right, let's see the before. Let's mute it. So again, the skin color by itself, it's very broad in terms of its color. There's no details. We did add details with our baked utility textures to end up here. But even in this, there's no blemishes and the colors are a bit broad. So when we add the blemishes, we have this incredible level of detail. And of course, the higher you go, if you go all the way up to 1, you're starting to look like the skin is significantly aged. So if you're going for an elderly portrait, this would make sense, but we want to keep it lower, like 0.5 as an initial test. But oh, I love this kind of detail. It levels up our skin color significantly. And so let's see what this looks like in rendered form. Switch to slot 2. And render. Come on. Let's take a closer look. All right, before, after. Before, after. Oh, I love adding blemishes. Again, I just think it takes the shader to a whole new place of believability. It might be a touch strong. The more I shift between the two, the more I kind of notice the pattern. But I also think that that can be an illusion because the longer I stare at this, I think the better it looks. So let's compare it to our reference. Like this cheek right here, this type of pattern I think is absolutely evident in the noisy blemishes that we just added. This guy's nose. Let's turn off the properties over there. We're starting to see some of those patches take place. And you can play with these textures to your liking. I think what I might do is try switching them in the inputs just to see which one I like better. Switch to slot 3 and put it in the oven. All right, let's see how this one turned out. All right, so this is before the first version of noise. Okay, definitely more subtle. But then the original, no blemishes to the latest version. That might be a little more controlled. The better version, in other words. All right, so you're seeing a distinct little patch or mark show up here, which looks really good. There's definitely blemishes involved, but it's not quite as uniform as this version. So honestly, there's things I like about both. But yeah, this latest version I think is probably better, all things considered. Let's compare it to the reference. All right, so this is the latest version, the version before. I think the version before looks a little bit better compared to this particular reference. There's just more of that high frequency breakup in this guy's cheek. So maybe we need another component, because I think version 1 of the noise looks better close up like this, but zoomed out, maybe version 2 looks the best. I don't know, now I'm flip-flopping back to version 1 as maybe being better. This is a pretty common temptation for me, where I want to complicate it a little bit more and risk overcomplicating it unnecessarily. So yeah, I'm going to leave it as it is, just these two noise patterns. I kind of want to add a third, but I'm going to exercise some self-control and just remember in the back of my mind, maybe add that third component later. But for now, I want to remember we're going to be adding hair, and that could really change my perception. So I'm going to keep it simpler and just leave these two noise patterns for the time being. However, I do want to add a freckle component, so to speak. And that's going to be these very clear spots that I outlined earlier, right? All these little circles. And who knows, maybe that will even satisfy the urge to add another noise component. We will find out. Let me move these over to the right, make a little bit more room, change the direction of this node, and I'm going to make these freckles with a Voronoi pattern. So texture Voronoi, and we will grab the object coordinates once again, and also duplicate this color ramp, use the distance, and take a look at that texture data, which tells me the pattern is way too broad. Let's increase the frequency by going up to like 20, let's say, or 50 actually. Okay, now this is a size that I can flip the color ramp. And as I drag the black flag down, eventually we're going to be left with little white spots all over the skin. And these will become our freckles. So of course they need to be a lot smaller and lower frequency. Right now it looks more like chickenpox or something. So the lower we bring both flags, we're going to start to get into a place that can intuitively become freckles or moles. So I think the scale needs to come up again. Let's try 100, not 10. Okay, this is more what I'm after, at least in terms of scale and population. But all of them are perfect circles, which is not very organic. Freckles usually have some shape to them. And the way we can add that shape is with a noise texture manipulating the vector coordinates. All right, so let's duplicate a noise texture. We're going to add a color mix RGB node, object coordinates into the vector. And let's just reset the noise texture with the backspace key. We'll change the mix to be linear light, and we want that value to be pretty low, like 0.1. And let's mix the Voronoi vector coordinates with the noise texture, the color socket specifically. And now we can see that our shapes are being moved around. And we can adjust this with the scale, or let's try the detail first, up to 10. Okay, so now that changes it significantly. Probably a little too much. I don't want these to turn into streaks, but just not be perfect spheres. So let's take the factor down to 0.05. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Some of them are stretched, but none of them should be perfect circles. Yeah, that's totally feeling like a freckle to me. And, you know, this might be enough, honestly. What if I increase the roughness to like 0.7? Oh. All right, so this really changes it. How about 0.6? You know, this is a pretty sensitive setting. That's still a little too strong. How about 0.55? Okay, that feels good. The edges are a little bit broken up too. And now let's implement this into the color using another mix node. Again, it's going to be an overlay, but we're going to use this as the factor and choose a color for that second color slot. All right, let's take a look. Let's see, at 0.5, which is the default color, we shouldn't see any difference. Let's lower the value, and we should start to see freckle-like spots. Yeah, it's working out pretty good. You know, if we don't want them to be that strong, we can lower the white flag of our color ramp to like 0.5. But I do think it's important and highly recommend that these are present to some degree, whether it's subtle like this or whether it's strong. And now we just need to figure out if the population is exactly what I want. Let's increase to like 200 for the Voronoi scale. Maybe adjust the flags a bit. All right, so now we're getting a lot more of a freckled complexion. Yeah, maybe this is not quite the direction I want to go. What about 150? Yeah, still a little too high. I think I liked 100. It seems pretty, normal level of freckle blemishes in a face. Now, if any of the freckles stick out to you particularly, like maybe we don't want them in the lips at all, remember, this is a great opportunity for having those zones of the face. We can simply grab whichever one is the lips, this blue one right here, and we could completely subtract that. This will be quite the reroute of this noodle. We can move it all the way over here and subtract it, color mix RGB. Subtract, whoops, not soft light, subtract. And now that will be completely removed. All right, so if we mute this, there's a freckle on the lip. Unmute it, the freckle's completely gone from the lips. So that's one way if you want to be very specific with either removing blemishes from a certain area that we defined in the zones of the face, or if you want to add them to a particular zone of the face, like maybe the nose has a lot of freckles. Or maybe you want to use that open red channel of the third vertex color group to be its own unique zone for blemishes. But I think that's a little more complex. The first thing that I like to try, honestly, let's just mute that subtract, is adding a vector mapping node to simply move this pattern left or right, or up and down, any direction to get your blemishes off a particular area. I think that's the easiest. But yeah, I think at this point you kind of see how to implement the blemishes. Let's see what it looks like, just the color data by itself. All right, we've got some freckle spots clearly present in the color paths. Curious, it might be a little subtle once we do a render, but also we've got these kind of vertically stretched marks at the top. So I don't love those. What if we decrease the linear light to like 0.02? Get back to a more spherical shape, 0.03. Yeah, okay, we've got a pretty good spread. I don't think it's too much. Yeah, let's see what it looks like rendered. Switch to slot 3 and let her rip. Okay, let's see the big version. All right, the spots are clearly visible. A little on the subtle side, but that's more what I want than too harsh. So this is before. Actually, this is with the other noise pattern. I kind of want to do a version with this and the freckles. All right, but this is the original no blemishes. This is our latest version. Before, after. I do like the extra interest that the freckles bring, but the noise, yeah, I want to try a version like this first. I'm thinking it's just a little bit underwhelming, especially the nose, okay? I'm focused hard on this with the current version. The first noise pass breaks up the nose a lot better, whereas the current version, there's not a huge difference between that and the original. And this brings up a really important point about why blemishes are so important in my experience. Because when it comes to skin shading, the most common critique you'll receive is that the skin looks waxy. But it's very difficult to find someone who can explain why it looks waxy. And this comment is in reference to wax sculptures, which are really close to being lifelike, but they're still wax. And so my theory about waxiness is when the underlying skin color is too broad and not detailed enough, that's when you get a waxy appearance. And so this blemish pass is a direct attack on the waxy feeling. So you have to balance where I don't want it to be too blemished and look like the skin is damaged or the skin looks older than the shape of the head. but I also don't want it to be too subtle and risk it looking waxy. So I'm going to try a version of the previous skin noise with the freckles in slot 4. And remember, that's achieved simply by swapping the noise texture order here in the mix node. All right, let's see what that looks like. All right, let's take a closer look. This is the latest version compared to the previous version of noise. After, before, after. Yeah, I think I flip-flopped all the way back to thinking this is the better version. Now let's see what it looks like with no blemishes, latest version, no blemishes, latest version. A pretty substantial difference. I hope you agree. And at this point, I feel we've reached that satisfaction of a first version. I've already explained how I might want to tweak the noise a little bit, but I'm going to leave it like this. We'll start to add hair and then be in a better place to decide ultimately how to tweak this toward perfection. Oh, and one important thing to go over. We're using object coordinates for these noise patterns, and this is fine as long as the head never moves. Because if you did want to move your head and rig it, make it talk, these noise patterns would swim across the surface. They will not deform with the mesh. The only way that happens is if you're using UV coordinates. And so you could try to just plug in UVs right here, but almost guaranteed you'd see noticeable seams. And so if I wanted to rig this, I would simply need to bake a blemish texture map from these components, and then replace these components with the usual image texture like our others. And this is true for any object using object coordinates. Anything that would deform or be controlled by a rig will need explicit UV coordinates. So something to keep in mind. I'm sure some of you will want to do this with your head. Now to finish the video, let's render our various lighting scenarios. Let's take a look. I'm so happy with the way this is going. I think this is a huge upgrade. The skin is far more believable in my opinion, and it's holding up in each lighting condition. I am happy.